everyone to this DIIS seminar co-organized together with Copenhagen Business School. My name is Ida Marie Vammen. I'm a senior researcher here at DIIS and has been organizing this event together with Professor Lisa Richey and Sofie Henriksen. Today we will discuss the state of humanitarianism and how it is transforming as new and old crises emerge, new actors and technology enter the field, and we see new geopolitical reconfigurations. We will explore how these transformations will shape humanitarianism today, but also the future, and of course how humanitarian responses will affect the many people around the world that also depend so dearly on them. But we will also turn to the past to explore the historical entanglements and the ghost of coloniality that seems to continue to haunt the industry. With us today, we have a really great lineup of excellent scholars who in different ways have researched humanitarianism and the politics of humanitarian interventions for many years in different regions. So I've really been looking forward to this seminar today. We will start by two presentations. The first is by Pallister-Wilkins, titled Coloniality in Humanitarian Futures Thinking. Polly is an associate professor at the University of Amsterdam and a political geographer specializing in the intersection of humanitarian interventions, border control, and mobility in justice. Her latest research focuses on the role of race and racism in humanitarianism and the possibilities of decolonialization. She also authored the book Humanitarian Borders on Equal Mobility and Saving Lives, which I can warmly recommend to everybody. I think we have it in the library. So you can borrow it and take it home with you, which won the International Political Sociology Book Award last year. Our second intervention is by research professor at the Christian Michelsen Institute, Antonio de Lauri, who will give a talk titled Forms of Humanitarianism, Improvisation, Institutionalization and Absence. Antonio is an anthropologist focusing on legal and political anthropology, war and humanitarianism, and his current research on war and fun is funded by the ERC Consolidator Grant. He is the president of the International Humanitarian Studies Association and the founding editor-in-chief of the Journal of Public Anthropology. So welcome so much, both of you. We also have two great discussants, but I will wait with their presentation until later on. So I will give the floor to you now, Polly. I will also keep track on time, and I should say after these presentations and a shared discussion, you will also, of course, get the possibility to ask questions. So note them down, keep them in your mind, and we will have an exchange later this afternoon. Thank you so much for coming.
Okay, wow, what a great turnout. And oh, I sound a bit strange. Thank you, that's better, right? Yeah. Thank you to Ida for that really generous introduction. And so yeah, I am gonna talk about, I suppose, the context of what I'm gonna present to you today is kind of the idea, the notion that humanitarianism is in crisis. And attempts by a particular humanitarian organization to think about that crisis and to think about how to reflect on that in the future, going forward. You will see that I am saying it is by myself. The talk I'm giving is by myself and a co-author. It's based on an article that we have written, just putting the final edits to it. I'm not naming my co-author in this presentation because we're trying to keep the identity of the humanitarian organization that we're talking about a secret. Not a secret, but for now we're not naming them. I don't know how we're going to navigate this going forward. But if I named a co-author, some people might be very easily figure out what organization I'm talking about. And so this piece is really an attempt by us to reflect on a particular exercise that was designed by my co-author to try and address future humanitarian challenges. It was a futures sort of thinking exercise, a scenario planning exercise, and to sort of reflect on what happened when we were, and I was invited to take part in this exercise, reflect on what happened in these series of scenario planning exercises that we had. And so the article that we've written, what has come out of our reflections on this, is really concerned with the ongoing coloniality of our attempts to sort of think future humanitarianism. And in this, we interrogate the assumptions that crises such as climate change and the apparent end to liberal internationalism threaten the future of humanitarianism as future crises. And so instead, so sort of through our own critical reflections on our own involvement, and it's been quite hard to kind of reflect on ourselves, we're kind of studying ourselves here really, on our own involvements in these sort of future thinking, we argue that thinking about crises in future terms and the scenario planning methodologies that were deployed for mastering or an attempt to master this uncertain and dangerous future highlight actually and threaten to reproduce the coloniality of the humanitarian industry. And so through attempting to govern the future through anticipatory practices, we sort of really saw the ongoing structural effects of colonialism, or that they are overlooked, while the sort of the norms of Western liberal humanism and the positionality and experiences of humanitarians located in the global north are overrepresented and universalized, which results in the marginalization, of course, therefore, of alternative positionalities, experiences, and ways of being. And in the piece, we sort of really focus, we develop and we focus on what we're calling the geo-ontological assumptions, epistemological assumptions, and operational assumptions through which we see coloniality expressed in this work of thinking humanitarian futures differently. But while also trying really hard, and I don't think we managed this, but trying really, really hard to hold space for the radical potentiality of prefiguring a different future. But why should humanitarianism think about the future? Well, there's a sort of push, there's a move in the industry to think the future differently, in part because historically, for those in the room who are familiar with humanitarianism as a practice or as a field of study, right, we know that humanitarianism is historically reactive, right, rather than proactive, right? It responds to emergencies. It doesn't necessarily attempt to anticipate them, right, to intervene on them before they come into being, right? But increasingly, big players in the industry are attempting to try and think about how they can better respond to what they call future crises, better respond to climate change as a future crisis, better respond to the sort of the fears of a kind of end to an international liberal order. So this is the kind of field context in which we were attempting, both in the exercise, but also in our reflections on the exercise, to sort of think about humanitarian futures. And so why are we thinking, talking, and writing about the future? I realize this picture really ages me. I'm sure if I showed this to some of my students, they'd be like, oh, I don't know that. We've never seen that movie. Yes, I am a Gen X millennial. So in this, why we're talking about this, why we're thinking about it, why we're writing about it, why we want to reflect on this, and in the article that we've put together, right, we're really drawing on our own sort of respective conception, my co-author's conception, and my own involvement in this futures exercise, right? Where participants were asked to both think about the future, and these are participants who are professionals within the industry, and what we're terming kind of humanitarian adjacent professionals, so academics, other stakeholders. Importantly, when I say other stakeholders, I do not mean recipients of humanitarian aid, which we'll get to in a minute, but participants were asked to both think about the future through taking part in these kind of scenarios that were developed, and importantly, to critically reflect on doing so, in part because there is, and there was already baked into the exercise, a recognition of the kind of methodological limits of scenario planning, right? It's very hard to kind of have an imagination that doesn't consider and isn't based on pre-existing knowledge of the present. And in these exercises, you know, how was the future? What were these crises that were going to impact humanitarianism in the future? Climate change was one big one, huge one, and an end to what some people termed an end to liberal internationalism, and other people termed resurgent fascism. I don't quite know where the ball actually is on that line between an end to liberal internationalism and resurgent fascism, but this is how we're grouping it. Anyway, climate change is considered a problem for the future because it's thought that it exponentially increases the challenges that are faced by humanitarianism. It threatens the core of how humanitarianism is conceptualized because it is thought, right, it is assumed, it demands life-saving efforts at a planetary scale, right, rather than localized humanitarian emergencies, right, and threatens, as Peter Sloterdijk has said, the ability of persons to remain persons. Meanwhile, an end to liberal internationalism, or what some other people in the exercises called resurgent fascism, right, this is really based on sort of the attacks on humanitarian interventions by authoritarian regimes and liberal regimes, liberal democracies, that impact humanitarianism's normative pillars, right? So impacts, attacks the kind of the human at the center of humanitarianism and its operational potential, right? Disrupts the ability to intervene. So here we see discourses of dehumanization, right? Xenophobic races, Islamophobic, homophobic, transphobic populism, right? On the far right, threatening the universal human as the normative foundation of humanitarian action, and governments, societies engaging in increasing attempts at humanitarian obstruction, both in authoritarian regimes and in liberal democracies. But what conversations, what kind of academic conversations are we guided by and are we building on? And I'm not going to go deep into theory. You'll be pleased to know. We can maybe talk about that afterwards. But in our article, in our argument, we try to make sense of what was happening, what we were engaged in, by using futures studies. And we're using futures studies because actually its ontologies, epistemologies, and methodologies were used by the architects of the exercise to build the very kind of data that we are analyzing. And our reading of future studies is also informed by work in critical security studies and political geography. This is where I come in. My work, my theoretical disciplining comes in, right? We're also making use of the work in critical security studies and political geography on anticipation and scenario planning. But we are also guided by and building on the recent work that's been concerned with the colonial histories of humanitarianism, the racism in and the coloniality of the industry, and the demands for decolonisation. And these are demands for decolonisation that are happening both within the industry, right, from sort of certain elements, staff, practitioners employed in the industry, and also demands from civil society and demands from certain sections of the academy. And we're also building on the work that has kind of critiqued, in many ways, the resilience approach to humanitarian futures and the sort of the critiques of abandonment that this approach, it is argued, it engenders. But where do our reflections then lead? What, when we are sort of thinking, you know, we were having this sort of painful kind of attempt to kind of make sense of what we'd been experiencing in the first half of last year through these particular exercises, you know, where did we, how are we making sense of this? And we argue that thinking about humanitarianism in the future, and the stress is very much here on the future, too often actually betrays the coloniality of humanitarianism in the present. And I'll get on to why this is the case a little bit more in a minute. We also are sort of making a point about scenario planning exercises more broadly. We're arguing that scenario planning exercises actually sort of threaten or can threaten to project coloniality into the future, right? Unless participants actively, and have to really actively use such exercises for processes of decolonial thinking, decolonial, like deconstruction and reconstruction. And, you know, importantly, because humanitarianism is not a metaphor, right, alternative world making, structural world making, right? And this is something, you know, many people involved in these scenario planning exercises, critical people who are well aware of, you know, the contours, the current contours of the humanitarian industry, the problems that it faces, right, the hierarchies it faces, right? And even with all of this knowledge, right, and all of this, you know, cognizant knowledge, we, and I say we because I was involved in these workshops, like we still, we didn't do a very good job at this. Like, we really projected coloniality into the future. And so we kind of therefore challenge common sense framings of the future as not yet existing, and I'll get onto why in a minute, and scenario planning's requests to think the unthinkable, right? By asking, okay, yeah, but not yet existing and unthinkable for whom, right? Not necessarily, it may have been not yet existing or unthinkable for the people in the exercises, but actually, many of the issues that we discussed, they very much exist and they very much are thought about by a lot of people. And therefore, then we extend this critique to anticipatory methods more generally, and we ask, basically, who engages in processes of anticipation? Why do they engage in them, and how do they engage in them? And what types of harm do anticipatory methods overshadow? What do we not see when we attempt to think the future? What current present do we overlook? And so in doing this, we identify 3 areas, what we're calling geontological assumptions, which relate to the assumed subject or subjects of humanitarian futures thinking, in terms of both what is a danger, right, so climate change, what is in danger, the humanitarian industry itself, right, and who is in danger, already existing recipients of humanitarian aid, in concert with assumptions about where humanitarian crises happen. We identify epistemological assumptions, which relate to who produces knowledge about the future and how that knowledge is produced and why, right? So like why, you know, was it a lot of folks in the global north doing this kind of work? And operational assumptions. So how crises are to be governed, right? What type of techniques, what type of tools, what type of technologies is humanitarianism going to use, going to enact, going to, make use of to govern future humanitarian crises. And so in terms of geo-ontological assumptions, in relation to climate change, we see how climate change is manifested temporally and spatially in extreme weather events, or it's assumed climate change is manifested temporally and spatially in extreme weather events that target ongoing humanitarian spaces of operation, and has the potential to worsen harms and threaten humanitarian capabilities. While we were reflecting on this, I was in North America with the worst wildfires that have ever been recorded in North America. And for example, our scenario planning exercises never considered that the North American context could be a place of humanitarian crisis in the face of climate change. So this kind of assumption that that climate change is going to impact existing places, spaces, populations of crisis is super understandable, right? Given the moral economy of humanitarianism and its terms of engagement. However, we argue it's also indicative of humanitarian ontologies around who the subject of care is, and it raises fundamental tensions when it's assumed or it's argued that climate change is planetary in scale. So yeah, it's assumed the subjects of care were already those recipients of aid. Climate change was still assumed to be a future event rather than a current, present reality for many. And there's an idea in this, implicit in this, that the planetary holds this promise for sort of upsetting traditional geographies of humanitarianism by sort of highlighting the potential for disasters to happen anywhere. But, right, and it makes new communities vulnerable, but thinking at a planetary scale also risks flattening vulnerability hierarchies and actually fails to unsettle coloniality. So what we mean by that is we fail to identify and understand and think about how people are differentially positioned in relation to risk. Resurgent fascism, humanitarianism itself is centered as the subject at risk, both as a norm, right, committed to universal humanity, and as an interventionist practice. So this confers, again, reproduces the moral legitimacy of humanitarianism as the central normative and operational practice that is tasked with saving lives and by extension saving humanity. And it inadvertently, and I stress inadvertently here because everybody tried really hard not to do this, but actually this is what happened, inadvertently marginalizes communities and peoples whose humanity and ability to live has been historically threatened, and it renders banal the violence that they face, right? Historical patterns of violence are kind of invisibilized, so that certain present violent events are exceptionalized and are seen as a threat to the liberal order, assuming that all have had at some point access to and have experienced the full benefits of liberal peace and security in the past, when that's not the case, right? So practices of dehumanization here are also assumed to be in the future, right? Rather than ongoing lived realities for those whose standpoints and subjectivities have been underrepresented in humanitarianism, right? We have had decades of certain populations being subject to dehumanizing practices. Epistemological and operational assumptions ask questions about who are the people engaging in humanitarian futures thinking, how and why. Right? They're professional humanitarians and academics. And really interestingly, the exercises, even when we tried not to do this and we were told, think about the future, think about this, the exercises turned into present-day problem-solving exercises. People mobilized their existing expertise and experience to make sense of and to prefigure something that was going to happen in the future. So they prefigured the future from their existing experiences. And Importantly, as I said earlier, there were no participants who had been or were current recipients of aid, right? Meaning that the exercise was conducted from within the epistemic boundaries of humanitarianism itself, and as something that is done as a form of governance, something that is reproduced by the doers, rather than something that is experienced by those subjected to humanitarian governance, and something really importantly that is and has the potential to be resisted, the potential to be recalibrated by those who are the receivers of aid. And then operationally, right, how are future crises to be governed? How are they going to be intervened upon? Right, what tools, techniques, technologies do we use? Right, unsurprisingly to some of the people in this room, right, though we talked about technical fixes, even if we talked about them critically, right, we assumed there would be technical fixes. We assumed that there would be attempts to make climate vulnerable populations resilient, right? There was an assumption that humanitarianism would sort of practice and continue to make use of the tools that we already have. It would still continue to be a site of experimentation, right, in the pursuit of saving lives. And here, really, I think importantly, respondents were really concerned, and they were really aware of this, right, and were very concerned with the possibility that humanitarianism in the future could find itself acting as a technical fix for securing kind of what they were terming racial capitalism's sort of worse excesses, right, as we sort of move to a carbon, different sort of carbon economy, without reflecting on whether or not humanitarianism has acted as a technical fix for securing racial capitalism in the present and in the past. And importantly, like these operational assumptions also clung to and really attempted to cling to and re-articulated and held fast to a belief in humanitarian norms of universal humanity, the power of neutrality, and the importance of impartiality. Again, projecting these into the future. But finally, and this is our attempt to not be so pessimistic, and it's not my natural disposition. This is my co-author. We're also attempting, and this is what the exercise was attempting to do, and it didn't do it. But we are still trying to kind of cling to this idea that thinking about the future can also be emancipatory and empowering, containing as it does the promise of future world making. And we borrow this notion that's called Futures as Freedom, which comes out of actually the African Futures Forum. And it is a perspective on the future that presents a kind of a more open terrain, like not to be colonized by existing assumptions of what Annabelle Caggiano would call modernity or coloniality, but is evolving and empowering. And here it really shares clear overlaps with African futurist thought, with its focus on decentering, if not outright separation from Western knowledge, and optimistic sort of Western knowledge systems, and a sort of optimistic outlook. And I'm still to be convinced by this, right? And African futurism here, as opposed to the more well-known Afrofuturism, is concerned with what is and can and will be, while at the same time acknowledging and grappling with and carrying what has been. And so this means such an approach to the future is loaded, hopefully, possibly, potentially, with the perspective for upheaval. And there were certainly cases and times and moments in the exercise where this was the case. So it's not all coloniality all the way forward, backwards, sideways. But it was incredibly difficult to do, and there is still a lot more work to be done. And I will leave it there. Thank you very much. Let's mute myself.
Yes? Yes. Thank you. Yes, so sharing some thoughts about recent experiences and the long-term engagement with this idea of humanitarianism. And I would start from a story. Some years ago in Kabul, I'm not sure nowadays whether we can say the name of organizations. Let's say an organization that looks a lot like the ICRC, received some people there in Kabul received an offer from the Taliban. So this group of Taliban, they told them, if you help us to cut the hands of our prisoners, we will give you access to them, to all our prisoners. This was an interesting offer for the ICRC because it's been very difficult to access Taliban's prisoners, throughout the conflict. And then they said, plus you will help us, to save lives, because if we do that, we will do it anyway. But if you do that surgically, there will be, no risk. If we do that, many of them will die. So the people in Kabul, they were very interested and they started to discuss. They brought this offer to Geneva and they discussed it there. And eventually there was like a split. The political side of the organization said, maybe we should. And the doctors said, no, we can't, because we can't do medical interventions for no reason. So they refused. But this was an example for them to understand where to draw the line in terms of access, because access is a big thing for organizations. They always talk about access. So when this person from the ICRC was telling me the story, he was basically saying, this is what being a humanitarian is, basically. This is what we do. This is our everyday job. So in a way, it was kind of making an attempt to define what humanitarianism is also. And then I was thinking, but is it? Yeah, and it's not easy to define. So what is this humanitarianism we are talking about exactly? What, for example, takes together organizations like the Free Burma Rangers, this group of paramilitary people who provide medical services, evangelical work, with what do they have in common with groups of refugees that help other refugees, so the so-called diaspora, humanitarianism, or volunteers along the borders of Europe or the UNHCR. What all these different groups have in common? Do they have something in common? So this difficulty of grasping the object of our investigation makes it also more difficult to understand when we develop a critique of humanitarianism. What kind of critique is that? A critique of what exactly? Because here is not simply about the proliferation of actors that we have seen in the field in the past years, but also a kind of conflagration of the concept itself. So then, to explain how, for example, the different temporalities and phases of humanitarianism and also the groups involved in humanitarianism work, I can refer to 3 different kind of fields location where I worked. And also because these different kind of realities and temporalities, they explain how difficult it is to understand what kind of crisis humanitarian organizations address. So the first one is from Lampedusa, the first kind of phase or temporality that I want to talk about. So research in Lampedusa, South Italy. And here I have defined this kind of form of humanitarianism as improvisation, because I was, when I was there talking with a lot of people to understand this phenomenon of migrants arriving from mostly now from Tunisia, and how to handle this the problems associated with the arrival and disembarkment of migrants. I was trying to understand who is involved, and then there is also there like a plurality of actors involved compared to what it used to be. For example, in the 90s, where the local population would take care of the migrants. Now the local population is completely alienated. So humanitarianism in Lampedusa basically transformed the idea of welcoming, the idea of help. So now the local population in Lampedusa cannot even go to see who arrived. So the police create a sort of protection site when there is a boat approaching the coast, and only those who are authorized can be there, which are very few selected organizations, and of course the military and the police. And also the hotspot center, which was before ran by local people, now is part of the the hotspots system of Europe. So also that one is off limits. It's the only place where nobody can go in Lampedusa. But migrants, they go out very often from there. So there is this kind of schizophrenic approach. There is a hole in the net, everybody knows that, and all migrants, they spend the day in the center of the island. So, and then I was talking with volunteers who are there to help. And many of them, they really improvised their form of solidarity. So they saw in the news, from different parts of Europe, what was going on, and they said, "Oh, we have to help." And I met this group of people who did collected some money from friends and also something online, and eventually they were able to buy this small boat. They went to Lampedusa, and they were out at sea, and then they realized, oh, but we don't know how to keep people out of the water. That's very difficult. So it's just a very practical thing. So they had to come back, and I asked help to the authorities. So this kind of form of humanitarianism, which is there in a form of expression of solidarity, often tries to take a distance from the work of big international organizations. So they say we are different, we don't have those values, we want to express solidarity in a different way, bottom up, is a grassroots response. And this idea of grassroots is very often abused, because we often forget that there is solidarity which is grassroots, but also hate, racism. These are also very grassroots sentiments often. So what is the impact? What kind of crisis that this form of humanitarianism addresses? It's mostly symbolic, the impact, and sometimes useful for the volunteers more than for the recipient of their help. But at the same time, it has a big impact in terms of shaking the idea of some of the foundational ideas of what humanitarianism is, according to, for example, some institutional organizations. The second phase or temporal aspect is from Iraq, the Iraqi Kurdistan. And this is a form that I called institutionalization of humanitarianism. Why? Because especially in the past few years, where, for example, the Peshmerga have been largely supported by Western donors and governments, because of course their kind of struggle at that point in history, not always, but at that point in history became very consistent with the needs of other governments. They have been heavily supported. The Iraqi Kurdistan received a lot of funding. So now you have a form of humanitarianism there that is very much de facto a form of welfare. So humanitarianism as welfare. And you can see it from the work of UN Habitat, for example. They give apartments to Kurdish people in a way that works very similar to what governmental institutions would do. They have lists, there are priorities based on needs, and people are allocated in different neighborhoods also based on their preferences. For example, they also, the UN there, they also have established a new program to investigate war crimes, which is in a way a parallel system to the Kurdish justice system, because what they do is they collect evidence and so on, but they don't communicate this to the Kurdish authorities because they still have a death penalty there, right? And so they don't want anyone to be charged of death penalty. So they collect this evidence and they keep it for themselves. So a sort of form of parallel state that Kurdish people very heavily rely to. The third aspect is from Afghanistan, the place where I've been doing most of my research. And here we have seen forms of humanitarianism ranging from highly institutionalization to absence. So when I first went to Afghanistan in 2005, Afghanistan was, Kabul especially, was like the hub, the global hub of humanitarian aid. The rents of houses in Kabul was comparable to the rents in Manhattan. So everyone was there. The driver of a small NGO's salary was $500 per month. The salary of a judge was $300. You know? So there was this parallel economic system that was established through these large amounts of funding, hundreds of NGOs. So everyone was there. And that has been the case for 20 years, up to 2021, when the Taliban came back to power, and there was this very catastrophic evacuation, which left Afghanistan with this sudden absence of humanitarian funding. And also all the kind of the consequences of this, the construction of this parallel economic system, they all exploded suddenly because people didn't have job. There were no new factories. The agricultural sector was not being developed. So all became aggravated by the fact that for 20 years they were completely dependent on humanitarian aid. So these forms of absence then that also in a way manifest a certain idea of how do we define crisis, right? Yes, because nobody could neglect that there is still ongoing crisis there, but yet not enough to justify, for example, the governments to negotiate access with the Taliban, something that they have always do. They always have done, right? And I made the example, I started with the example of that discussion between ICRC and the Taliban. So then our critique of humanitarianism, what does it exactly refer to? For example, if we think of the successes and failures, when do we define an intervention successful or when it is a failure, and according to whom? If we consider, for example, just again the case of Afghanistan, a failure, but for whom? In 2008, a report from Akbar established that out of the billions spent in Afghanistan up to that moment, at least half of it came back to the US in terms of subcontract. So was it a failure for the US? No, not really. So then we have to engage our critique with the real intentions of that presence and that intervention, not on the abstract ideas. So once we decide how to engage and what kind of critique we want to develop and on what, then of course the question is, is there something that we want to save of that system? What is, for example, that we can keep out of our criticism? And for example, we have seen that also in these very days where in moments of historical despair, such as the case of Gaza now, we still turn to the UN, for example, to look for hope. What happened at the ICJ was a moment, just a glimpse of hope in a very desperate moment. So then, again, it's what becomes very difficult also as researchers is understanding if our critique, is towards the actors of humanitarianism or towards, for example, the values, some of the values. And if we want to, for instance, try to re-understand those values, for example, the concept of humanity, through what means, how. What South Africa did, for example, at the Court of Justice, gave a little bit of an idea of how the concept itself of humanity could be redefined, by different actors. Because the concept of humanity has been historically used to create inequalities, rather than, to create, to unify. Humanity always implied an us and them, inside, outside. That is the constitutional aspect of the notion of humanity. So, but how does a post-colonial, for example, understanding of humanity look like? And how can that be developed? So, just to conclude, what I find very interesting in this work, but also very challenging, is this idea of expressing a critique of humanitarianism, but that really remains, grounded in what really happens, and not on the abstract dimensions of humanitarian aid, but also on what survives that kind of critique, what emerges as something that can bring forward, something. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now I would like to invite you two and our two discussants up to these tables. And while you sit down, I will just present our two discussants, which is Professor of Globalization at Copenhagen Business School, Lisa Ann Richey. Her research is on understanding business as a critical player in global development and humanitarianism. She is the author of several books, most recently a book which I love the title, Batman Saves the Congo, Business, Disruption and Politics of Development, written together with Alexandra Budavin. She is currently leading a collaborative research project on everyday humanitarianism in Tanzania. So I think we will also learn something about more humanitarianism from below now, feeding very well into Antonio's reflection. The other discussant is my dear colleague, senior researcher Nauja Kleist. Her research is focused on the interlinkages between mobility, belonging and social order. And for the past year, she has been coordinating the collaborative research project called Diaspora Humanitarianism in Complex Crises, which focuses on the Somali diaspora and how they engage in humanitarianism and development in Somalia, with attention to mobility regimes, conflict and international humanitarian system, as well as gender and family relations, belonging and affect. So I don't know who want to start. Maybe you, Lisa, as you are the guest in the house.
Let me see if I can figure out how to turn on my... Is that working now? Great, good. Thank you so much. It's fantastic to see so many people here. And thank you for two very provocative presentations, provoking us from very different perspectives. I'd like to respond a little bit to some of the issues that you've raised, although not all of them, with some reflections, as Ida has suggested, from a collaboration that I'm involved in on everyday humanitarianism in Tanzania. Now, this is a multidisciplinary collaborative project that is with a series of researchers and universities, and particularly with 7 colleagues from the University of Dar es Salaam and also colleagues from Danish and UK-based institutions. And what we're doing in the project is we're actually trying to really problematize something that Polly, I think, actually introduced us to, which she actually called something very fancy, like the humanitarian ontology. We don't call it something quite so fancy in this grounded project, but it's the idea of what honestly is it that we think of when we think of humanitarianism? What is it we think it is as a thing? And for us, it's quite important to think about who do we think about as being humanitarians? And what kinds of actions do we think about as humanitarian, particularly for us looking at Tanzanians who help during times of crisis in Tanzania. And these can be protracted crises, like one of the most ongoing struggles with living with, integrating, reintegrating, and managing in a very increasingly hostile refugee regime, the refugees in Western Tanzania, but also acute crises like floods, which are increasing in unprecedented levels in areas like Dar es Salaam, the capital, but also in other places like Morogoro. And most recently, we had some horrific videos sent to us on WhatsApp from the north of Tanzania in a time when it's normally not even rainy, and now it's actually flooding and washing away people's homes and their livelihoods. So we look at these kinds of crises, and we think it's important to focus on why it is that calling something humanitarian carries a certain kind of power. And this is why we're trying to document very explicitly the kinds of actions that Tanzanians are taking, because we do really question the assumption of North-South helping. We do really question the problematic perception that humanitarianism is something which usually involves European people wearing blue hats. And this is not to say that formal humanitarianism is not an institutionalized reality, which is in some circumstances extremely important for people. But always, already, before and at the same time and afterward, there are people who are helping locally. They're doing it informally. They're doing it, I believe, as you called, improvisationally as well. And we need to think, I think, about what that can teach us about big H humanitarianism. Because I don't think that we need to just constantly theorize and re-theorize these kinds of critiques, which I think have been done very well already in the literature. But we actually need to understand, what does it do when you make something humanitarian? Or when you, in drawing from, for example, securitization theory, when you securitize something, what does it mean when you humanitarianize something? And I think drawing from local practices and our understanding from this research base, we really want to get down to the dirty practicalities. So in Tanzania, when you sound a horn, you piga kalimbo, you basically have someone who is authorized by the local village government to declare when there is in actual fact an emergency. So Craig Calhoun, the theorist who theorizes the emergency imaginary, right, gets us to think about the fact that we suspend remarkable levels of ethics. For example, the idea that the ICRC might get themselves actually taken to Geneva, considering the possibility of mutilation as exchange for access, as a reasonable ethics, is attributable to the emergency imaginary. But this imaginary gets created by particular institutional actors. And in Tanzania, there are people who are authorized to create that emergency, to say, now, this isn't just the usual problems, right? Matatizo ya kawaida. People are living in poverty. People have very real problems. But when you're trying to, as our research has showed, convince people that some people are worthy of helping, and now is the time that you need to do that, we've just gotten the data in from a large-scale survey across the country in areas of crisis, where we've really finally been able to document, right, empirically and systematically, that people do make very clear, specific decisions about when to help, and that the emergency is constitutive of being authorized to ask for additional help. So some of the very general findings that we found in this research so far are very similar to the things that we see institutionally in humanitarianism. Somehow we had perhaps imagined they would work differently, that local givers would give differently than international donors. But actually, this may sound familiar to many of you in this room. In our study of Tanzanian giving, we found, for example, that all giving that's described to us, both in terms of our statistical survey data, but also in terms of our increasingly interesting in-depth interviews and follow-up interviews and conversations, giving is reactive. It's not proactive, exactly as Polly had critiqued the international humanitarianism scenarios for being. It's very much the way that people give. Assessment is important. People spend amazing amounts of time informally trying to collate and triangulate information amongst WhatsApp groups when someone asks for help, about who knows that person, about whether or not it really is an actual crisis, about whether or not they really are a reliable recipient. Trying to do exactly the same kinds of, log frame related activities that the rest of us are engaged in formally. We also found that people really don't help their neighbors. They help their friends in the neighborhood. And we had expected that proximity, on the basis of a lot of interesting work, including some theories of neighborliness as the building blocks for democratization, we had really imagined that being in close physical proximity would somehow make a difference to how humanitarianism is done. And what we've seen is it makes a difference to these humanitarian principles, particularly of neutrality. And ongoing research in other places that's looking at everyday humanitarianism has also shown a similar thing, that the notion of neutrality just doesn't make any sense. That would be a little bit like saying, oh, why don't you just give money without considering whether or not it's going to be effective? So that would be ineffective altruism, which, believe it or not, is something which is really, really important to everyday humanitarians in Tanzania. People don't want to waste their money. They don't want to waste their energy. And they spend a lot of time documenting and assessing whether or not this is something which they can do, so that they can figure out how to make best use of their resources to help their friends in the neighborhood. So just, I'll end quickly. I know we don't have a lot of time. But I think that what we have learned a bit about big H humanitarianism is what we're working through as the humanitarian fallacy, right? This belief that somehow we really do have these humanitarian principles, and that this should be something which is done differently. Well, just like we see in the critiques that have been put both sort of theoretically but also pragmatically from the examples that you've given us, we really see that all helping is based on relationship. Okay? It's based on an actual encounter, whether or not that's mediated through some sort of digital technology or celebrity propaganda. As some of you know, that's another area where I've done a lot of work. But it's quite similar. We see quite similar kinds of power dynamics. This is why NGOs need to make us adopt a single child, as many of you know. And so to be able to understand a little bit more about how these processes of humanitarianization work, we need to explore more some of the issues about who is actually helping, why they're helping, and how it is that we can get these entanglements to become something which is more on the terms of greater equality, greater solidarity, and not just reinforcing power relations, which we do critique. Polly has critiqued the sort of larger racist notions about how we carry these ideas of a racist humanitarianism into the future. And Antonia has actually given us a very specific example about how it is that we actually get a lot of things when we look at the grassroots. And some of those are definitely based on hatred and anger and not based on solidarity or this notion of humanitarian love. But I think that we need to look at both levels, especially looking at more grounded research. So thank you for giving us some things to think through. Thanks for letting me share our findings.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lisa and Ida, and our speakers for this really fascinating seminar and the really, really inspiring and rich presentations. I have a similar kind of research project. It focuses on Somali diaspora humanitarianism. You can say it's a subset of everyday humanitarianism if you want. So specifically, it focuses on how Somali diaspora groups around the world, mainly in Kenya, in our case, in Zambia, and in Denmark, engage during complex crises in the Somali regions. I just came back from Nairobi to meet with my Kenyan and Somali research partners. We had seminars to present our initial findings and most importantly get feedback and critical questions in terms of our research. So what I'll do is to briefly outline like three kind of main points from our findings, and then I have some questions for you guys. So in terms of what we do, we look into the mobilization and the delivery of these kinds of support practices or practices of giving during crisis in Somalia. And we also look at the relationship to the international humanitarian system to some degree. And in terms of that, what we do see a lot of similarities, as Lisa also talked about, but we also see some very clear differences in terms of giving practices, in terms of accountability, especially. So the procedures that Somali diaspora groups use, and this can be kinship associations, it can be mosques, it can be families, it can be a lot of different actors who give. That it's the accountability measures rather being procedural, paper, all of that. It's embedded in social relationships and trust and social control. Rather than international humanitarian principles and a lot of paperwork. That's one thing. We also see a lot of mutual skepticism and distrust between the international humanitarian systems and various diaspora donors. Not only, but a main tendency is this distrust. Do they have an agenda that we shouldn't be supporting? Both sides. Why aren't they coordinating? So that's international humanitarian system to diaspora actors, and the other way around. Why is it so slow, etc.? So there are these tensions, but also attempts to collaboration. And that finally relates to simultaneous but contradiction trends of, on the both sides, a widening gap, I think, with securitization, resurgent fascism, etc., etc. The gap is getting bigger, but also an interest. And there's also a realization in big parts of, I think, the international system of the importance of these actors, just like the migration development emphasis a few years ago. It's like, hey, they said remittances, it's more than development aid, it's also more than humanitarian aid. In terms of Somali practices, so giving is an established practice in Somali society. It has a strong religious aspect as well. And we can conceptualize it as humanitarianism perhaps, but it comes with implications. sometimes diaspora actors are seen as new humanitarian actors. That's misleading. They have been doing this for a very long time, but the attention is new, right? So let's keep these two newnesses apart. There are also different forms of giving. Some is your friend in the neighborhood, yes, or in the distant village somewhere, but there are also other forms of giving that doesn't depend on like actual encounters of knowing somebody. It can be difficult to distinguish between like giving in crisis and other kinds of giving. And today we also heard a lot about where it's like these future scenarios, humanitarianism, development planning. I mean, a lot of things are actually interlinked. So it's not the same dynamics, but I think there are parallels. And then we also see, as I think Lisa also said, that there are inequalities. We can see that there's mitigation of poverty perhaps, but there's also reproduction of inequalities, as is well known from a lot of other overall relationships. But my question to you, to both of you, is so what does it mean to name something humanitarianism? What are the implications? Where are the limits? When does it, and I know you asked so many questions, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna ask them back to you. So where do we draw the lines of this? So please.
I'd already written that down before you even asked. Yeah, I'd already written that down. Isn't that funny? I preempted your question. I projected it into the future. I mean, it does too. I mean, it's a normative framing, right? But it also then engenders and mobilizes particular institutional responses. I think to call something a humanitarian problem fixes it in space and time, right? I think there's a lot of, the work that's been done on humanitarian crisis, it's very much about this idea that sort of, it has a beginning point and it has a supposed end point, right? Those endpoints hardly ever come, and we have systemic crises, but there is an idea that it's locatable. I'm speaking very much as a geographer now. It's locatable. It's intervenable upon, right? So it's not like one of these wicked problems, whatever we call them these days. And it's a problem that demands a particular type of response that's rooted in particular understandings of humanity, right? So it's not necessarily a development response, which would, be rooted in a particular kind of understanding of economic exchange or economic relations. It's a problem that is sort of supposedly mobilizing this thing we supposedly all share, which is humanity, and then demands particular types of responses, but responses which are supposed to be interventionist, but at the level of life and not necessarily at the level of structure, system change. Yeah, that is how I would answer that question. I could go on about this for hours, and I'm going to shut up, and I'll let Antonio.
Yeah. Is it working? Now? Yes. Okay. So first of all, we have to consider what do we associate with the notion of humanitarianism, and it's emergency, urgency, exceptional measures. So then, when you call something humanitarianism or humanitarian, you are not calling it something else, right? So it's a political intention. And if we look at, for example, the migration, the so-called crisis of borders in Europe. So to call it a humanitarian crisis, it means that it requires a certain kind of interventions, which are, based on emergency, on the idea of urgency. And so you don't talk about other things that would be associated with the idea of migration and mobility, like legal rights. So I think that is, for me, the most problematic aspect or challenging aspect of defining something as humanitarian. So the idea of placing something within a certain space that requires a certain kind of interventions, and thus disallowing other kinds of interventions, as also Polly mentioned, more structural or based on different kind of configurations of reality, legal rights, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to follow on to what you said. I think that the other thing that it does is it actually legitimizes what might have in other circumstances been an illegitimate entry point for other actors, right? And that's the thing we don't often think about, is the idea that by calling something a humanitarian thing, an humanitarian crisis, a humanitarian emergency, or just humanitarian situation, then you're legitimizing that someone can be authorized to come in and help who otherwise wouldn't be. And the interesting thing is all the politics around that. I mean, in Tanzania, we've had some very interesting discoveries by our lawyer colleagues, because they've just redone the law around the Tanzania Disaster Management Act, which has actually formally outlawed the possibility of everyday humanitarianism in Tanzania, right? That citizens are not allowed to give individual help unless they go through the approved government structures. And so the idea is that if you call something a humanitarian emergency, then you say, okay, now is the time when we get this particular key person who can come in and make those kinds of adjudicating decisions.
I mean, can I come back on that? In terms of what, I mean, Antonio was saying, also in terms of, I mean, the migration crisis. I mean, this is the perfect example. I mean, and this is what I wrote a whole book about. In terms of migration and in terms of, deaths at sea, calling it a humanitarian crisis and not a crisis of the border, a crisis of European racism, not allowing certain people to move in, the ways that Western people are privileged and allowed to move. What it does is it necessitates and demands, because we have this idea that we need to save lives, we need to relieve suffering, and we need to uphold human dignity, right? It facilitates and enables, for example, preemptive policing operations in international waters, which would not in any other context be allowed to take place. You cannot intercept a vessel in international waters unless, right, it is in distress and people are dying. And so what the European Union does is it preemptively categorizes all migrant vessels as in distress and in need of saving to enable effectively the capturing of people on those vessels. So actually what it enables is an extension of European border control into non-European space. It's a perfect example.
I guess it also raises a question that the kind of phenomena that the two of us look at, I mean, is it then the same? Because there are certain dynamics, at least in the Somali case, I mean, which is really not regulated in the same way as in Tanzania or the other ways that, if we should call it something else. And we had at the seminars in Nairobi, we had people asking of, so how do you define humanitarianism? What about resilience? What about dependency? So using the name also kind of generates a lot of connotations in all different kinds of directions that that are relevant to discuss, but are also like drawing on repertoires and vocabularies which is embedded in the international humanitarian system. So maybe we need more terms. I don't know. What do you think?
So the fact is also, and again, about calling humanitarianism or something else, how do you, for example, prepare the public to accept and tolerate certain things, right? So again, with the example of migrants in Europe, and the idea that some people find it tolerable, that around, figures are not certain, but 30,000 more or less people died at sea, only at sea, on the age of Europe in the past 20 years, more or less. And because that is a humanitarian crisis. So things become tolerable in a way because of the idea that, also the forms of interventions, in a way are kind of forced within a certain kind, spectrum of activities. So even volunteers that are pushed, they are, but within that kind of configuration. So scholars are normally very good in finding new words, but I think that is not the main issue. The fact is more about manifesting and creating, in a way, also clear evidence about what is happening in that kind of configuration. You know, what does it mean to call it humanitarian, and what do you find acceptable? For example, when I was in Lampedusa myself, I thought, my God, here there are, I mean, it's so full of researchers, journalists, everybody knows about it. So that why does nothing happen? And the idea of the humanitarian narrative is also part of the answer, you know. So it's not only about creating new words, but also different kind of forms of engagement.
Oh, there are no humanitarian solutions to political problems. Right? I mean, and that's what calling something humanitarianism does. It effectively removes it from the realm of the political and places it into the realm of the exceptional. And I think we can call, and I don't think it's about calling it. I think it's also about recognizing the type of interventions that are taking place, right? So, you know, we can see particular forms of harm reduction, particular forms of caregiving, which could be better described as mutual aid or better described as solidarity. But those also come with a political history and a political context which makes the liberal order uncomfortable, right? You start talking about mutual aid, you start talking about solidarity, and people are like, oh, are you crazy, leftist? Like, do you want a global revolution? Well, yes, but I mean, you know, whereas humanitarianism is safe. I mean, and this is why it's the industry that it is, right? It secures the liberal international order. As, you know, we can call them mutual aid, we can call them solidarity, but many of the times they're not actually mutual aid or solidarity. They are still practicing humanitarianism. So I think it's important to look at the practices and not simply only what we call things. I mean, the work that I did in Greece with grassroots humanitarians, many of whom were trying and saying they were practicing mutual aid, were not really, right? They were practicing very emergency base level humanitarianism. They might politically have been guided from sort of anarchist principles of mutual aid, but if you actually looked at the practice, it was exactly the same as the faith-based evangelical organizations. They were doing exactly the same work. They were doing the same work as big international organizations, which got really frustrated because there was actually nothing for them to do because all of these grassroots people were too efficient, you know? So I think it's also important to look also at the practices and not also just what we're calling things.
I think I will stop this interesting discussion, and so there's also a bit of time for questions from you, and for those of you who also follow this seminar online, you can text in your questions and we will see how many we can get through. I already see a few fingers. We have Robin here, and I think we will pile them together, so maybe take 2 or 3 questions together, and then give time.
Thank you. I've heard a lot of interesting comments about what humanitarianism is, different forms, different assumptions, how we think about the present, how that projects into the future, different actors, relations, power, and norms. But I haven't heard so much about crisis, the last word of this title. There's also a lot of different things one could say about what crisis is. Is it a crisis of legitimacy? Is it crisis as a rhetorical tool? Is it real existing crisis, international crisis, moral crisis? So when you're talking about humanitarianism and crisis, which kind of crisis do you have in mind?
Yes. Just a second there. It's the season. Well, suppression in humanitization, as well as dehumanitization, technology and the effects regard technology in use. Very interesting leveling in this much appreciated design approach and explained today. Thank you very much. Epistemologies and ontos, of course, we would expect to address or have in all seats here today a comment how to what does stereotyping affect in these traditional theoretical approaches, and humanitization should be safe. shouldn't it? Such nice comments today. Thank you very much. Just to finish off, quick, is it possible to have these interesting meditative slides sent of today's Explain? Thank you very much.
Yeah, maybe, yeah.
Thank you so much. Very interesting. So I have a quick question about the concept of solidarity. I myself is working in a similar areas. So my question would be how to actually really balance this kind of concept or idea of solidarity idea without really leaning towards this kind of like favoritism, because to a certain extent solidarity also entails the idea of acting partially to a specific group of communities, specific group of individuals, etc. I do know that different organizations specifically endorse different principles. For example, Norwegian People's Aid, solidarity is part of their endorsed principle, replacing the impartiality principle, for example. But then I have trouble really understanding the fine line between this kind of solidarity idea or ideology, while at the same time really not kind of like losing track about how to act in a way that is not overly partial. Thank you.
I think you can start.
There was one here, I think.
Yeah, but maybe let's start with these three and then...
Well, crisis, the notion of crisis, of course it was a bit implicit in several of the things we said. One optimistic way of looking at crisis is in terms of how it was defined by Antonio Gramsci, for example, is that a crisis creates the moment of possibility of something known that is dismantled, opening the space for something that is unknown. Right, but also there, and that would be the same with the concept of solidarity. It is the way within the humanitarian framework how notions of crisis and solidarity and so on are in a way redefined. And I did mention the difficulty of understanding what kind of crisis do different forms of humanitarianism address, for example, right? So the UN habitat in Iraq, what kind of crisis is it addressing? The same degree or proportionate or scale of configuration of crisis as they would do, for example, in a different phase, temporal phase of humanitarianism. So this idea of crisis is not like a universal, established once and for all, but it changes constantly, based also on the politics of the organization, but also of the reactions. In a way, it can also become a counter-humanitarian aspiration if we use it in that way, in the Gramscian way, in terms of understanding what can come after. Because one big issue with humanitarianism always, and this is not an absolutely new thing, is the transition to an after. What comes after humanitarianism? What happens after the humanitarian intervention? So the idea of crisis also there could be one element to address this discussion.
I mean, I think yes, absolutely, and I think it's also for humanitarians. I mean, there is an assumption that it's a break in the norm, right? But again, I think this depends where you're situated and where you're situated in relation to particular harms. And I think what was very telling in these futures exercises that we were doing was that the crisis was assumed to be in the future, and it was assumed to be a break in the norm. And actually, the types of things, climate disasters, huge sort of fascistic oppression based on, marginalized identities, was a crisis that was yet to come. Yet actually, because most of the people in that exercise, not all, but most of the people in that exercise were white Europeans and North Americans situated in the global north who had themselves never been vulnerable, right, could not conceive of the fact that actually this is not a crisis for people in the future. This is a lived reality and has been a lived reality for people in the past and people in the present, right? So I think it's also really important to think about who determines what a crisis is, who does that labeling of crisis, because that's an act of power. Because as soon as you label something a crisis, you are demanding a particular type of response, right? And that's often a humanitarian response, right? So I think it's important also then to think about, who does this labeling? When does something get labeled a crisis? And in the context of humanitarianism, it's the humanitarian industry itself. It's not necessarily, usually ever, the people who themselves are subject to risk, to harm, to vulnerability, right? In fact, some of the, the worst sort of invisibilization and then sort of that we've seen, the sort of the processes of abandonment that we continue to see are because we don't hear and listen to people, saying this is a crisis, actually, because the labeling goes on by people usually at a distance, usually far removed, based on also, again, particular ways of thinking, seeing, and understanding the world. And so you have communities saying, climate change is a crisis. Climate change is a crisis for life, but not solely for human life, right? But for all life on the planet, right? But, for example, humanitarianism can't conceive of that and consider that because of the central figure of the human, right? But if we are to consider and think about life, future, on this planet, there's a necessity to actually think ontologically differently around what life and who and what life is being saved in this context. So yeah, it's really, I think, important to think about crisis as an act of power, and I think humanitarianism in crisis it's humanitarians themselves claiming their own industry is in crisis. And they're not wrong, but also if you spent any time with humanitarians, they are consistently in crisis mode. Everything is a crisis, right? Trying to get them to think, beyond the end of the day and to get them to have a kind of different temporal kind of view of the world that honestly literally extends from beyond the end of the day, it can be really, really hard. I'm speaking from very frustrated experience at the moment. Right? So I think that's an important thing to think about when we think about crisis.
Can we just remind people there's a place where humanitarianism isn't in crisis? And that was what we learned about yesterday at the PhD defense by Sophia Henriksen, which is really fascinating because actually the humanitarian tech folks, people working in tech for good, they're not in crisis. They don't have any existential concerns that their work isn't valuable or that they are really caught between the imperatives of solidarity and neutrality. They are absolutely certain that these humanitarian futures are going to be solved by a kind of dehumanized humanitarianism, an algorithmic humanitarianism, right? Which will give us mathematical neutrality. And I think that this is a real problem for us to seriously consider. And we had some fantastic discussions with Sophia around her work yesterday because, there is a real risk here, a real ontological risk, to take back to Polly's big word. But it is a risk about whether or not, as I think Shin had pointed out, we do need partiality in order to actually engage in solidarity. And certainly from everyday humanitarianism, and I know we've talked about this from sort of both of our projects, when you come with these kinds of humanitarian principles and you ask people, does this impact why you give? Do you just try to give to everyone equally? I mean, people just think you're asking them an absurd question. Like, why would why would we be so foolish, really? And so if we want that kind of neutrality, we will get it from the algorithms. But I think we may find that we don't like what we've gotten.
Thank you so much. I think I will just, or you want to...
Well, it's what I also say. I mean, I think it's also really important to understand, neutrality is an operational principle. Right? I mean, it's not necessarily something that is actually kind of an ethical norm that is under, it's an operational principle as much as it is anything else. And I think that's important to understand.
Let's have a quick round of final questions. And also if there's some online, let's have them also. Stefano?
Very quickly. Thank you very much. I would like for you to spend a bit of time articulating the relation between business and humanitarianism, and the role that it may have into compounding the crisis and or portraying to be the solution of it, and how that also translates into civil society groups acting like business, increasingly so. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. My question is also coming to the concept, like Antonio was saying about improvised type of humanitarianism, and how also this ties into future making and reactivity. Because I was wondering, isn't a lot of humanitarianism, as we know today, start as an improvisation to a sudden crisis, a sudden emergency? And isn't the fact that maybe they were misguided, the group you were talking about with the boat, it didn't really work out, but maybe in the future, by trial and error, maybe they will have a float of boats, like an army of boats to improve their action. Because for me, something that I feel like it comes out a lot is talking about helping also in a sense of value, and how like the value of helping can also like really be understood. Because I think there is, I mean, it was just a challenge and to connect it also to the future making and imagining future and how imagining help, because there is maybe a certain way in which humanitarianism is supposed to be done. So when it comes like to imagining a response, then people start thinking about standardized solution to standardized expected problems instead of like moving out of this box. So maybe the value of improvisation, which might be not as effective at the beginning, but it can still have a value, like it can also have an impact on this kind of like future temporal ways. So I just wanted to know your opinion on this aspect and how things will evolve and how they can connect. Thank you. I don't know.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And
Thank you. Very inspiring talks of the future of humanitarianism. And speaking of assumptions, are we assuming universalism as a sort of a continued principle here? I'm thinking in terms of geopolitical competition, tectonic plate shifts in global economies, etc. Could we imagine competing humanitarianisms in the future? A Chinese humanitarianism, for example, Confucian humanitarianism, just a big one, but if you can say something about that, thank you.
I think we also have one here. I can see her dying here.
No, I don't really have a super specific question. But from a practitioner's point of view, sometimes you get a bit provoked by some stereotypes that I find in a lot of research on humanitarianism, especially concerning the division of people working in aid, which is, I think sometimes the criticism come with like, I don't know, 20-year delay of who is actually taking decisions, actually working in the field where we work. So that's maybe just a point of reflection. The other issue that I find would be interesting to hear your opinions about is, where is the limit to the humanitarianism you are working with? Because I think maybe also in the sector, it's a bit more defined as humanitarian action, humanitarian intervention, but I completely agree that it is a thing that is, humanitarianism is a kind of a definition that is being a little bit muddy, where there is much more funding now in humanitarianism, where funding was in international development maybe 20, 30 years ago, and that's why everything is suddenly called humanitarianism. But I just really want to, also hear your reflections about that.
Thank you so much. And to not keep people too long, short answers, maybe we should just take a quick round and you can pick up on whatever you like.
Do you want to start? This way or that way?
You want to start, Nauja?
Yeah, so to the last comment, I think that's a very good comment. And in the specific project that I'm looking at, DIIS Humanitarianism, there are actually a lot of people who work, who are on one hand, diaspora actors and also working in humanitarian agencies. So this clear distinction is completely blurred in practice. So it's more like in some cases it's clear cut, and in some cases it's really blurred. So this kind of like more dual blurry nature, I think it's a very good point to keep that in mind. Thanks.
Oh, thank you so much for making us talk about development. This is one of the things that I, as an old development scholar who now is studying everyday humanitarianism, it's a question of what is actually happening imically. How is it that people that you're studying actually define what they're doing? And one of the most interesting things is when I did the work in Democratic Republic of Congo, talking to practitioners to understand how they would literally demarcate the difference between one funding stream and the other. And what the biggest outcome difference had to do with was whether or not you had to have ongoing collaborations with the government. Humanitarian funding could run completely counter to the existing collaboration mechanisms, while development actually had to be embedded in ongoing relations with the government, which I think is an amazing example of the depoliticization of humanitarianism in operation. Business and humanitarianism, I will just say one thing because there are too many to say, which is I wonder if there's any humanitarianism that's not business and humanitarianism right now. With the increasing number of partnerships, the changing funding streams, the reliance on technology and collaborations with all sorts of different kinds of producers, also procurement policies, I think that we will not really be able to even imagine, if we're actually looking at the real world, that there was ever a time when it wasn't the business of humanitarianism. And I'm working on some collaborations at the moment, looking at what is this new business model and what does it actually mean for what we see on the ground and how things get done differently. Classic piece was Steve Hopgood, who wrote that, you know, if what we really want from humanitarianism is efficiency and effectiveness, it should all be done by Walmart. And that makes many people uncomfortable, but if you actually think about the values that we prioritize, Walmart is most effective at doing that. Somehow we have this imagination that there's something other that humanitarianism should be, which relates to values of altruism, which relates to some idea of doing something that's not just efficiency. And I think that it really needs to be made more uncomfortable. We need to think more about who counts. Are we really thinking about helping the helpers more than helping the helped, which is what we found in our study, Batman Saves the Congo? That was the take home right then and there from every single part of our evidence. So if we don't want to just help the helpers and we actually do want to help the helped, I think we have to look at what our colleague has pointed out, which is everyday existing humanitarianisms, which are not in the future. They are actually right here, right now, all over in every society that we can study, and thinking about what does it mean to make demands about social welfare, both locally and globally. That's not exceptional, right, but is part of people's actual human rights. Thanks.
Yeah, actually, Gino Strada said something. Gino Strada was the founder of an Italian NGO called Emergencies. And after 20 years of struggling, frustration about the work they were doing in Afghanistan, he said, why don't, instead of giving money to the NGOs, don't we send like some Italian companies to build these schools, because they were struggling to make this school functioning. So he said something similar. But in general, crisis needs, these are very easily commodified issues. So I agree that in a way we shouldn't see that as a kind of aberration of humanitarianism. That is simply the reality of humanitarianism, this combination of private sector and aid. And I was thinking yesterday that Sophie should, as a site of research, you should definitely go to Dubai at their annual exhibition, a humanitarian exhibition, where the private sector and the humanitarian organizations meet. To understand how the private sector can respond to all those needs. Yeah. So that is a very informative site for research. What you said about the actors is very interesting, because of course I feel the resistance when humanitarians. It's very similar to what happens inside the university or in the research sector. When maybe you just explore another field for a little while, and then maybe you write something, your work is on conflict, and you write something on migration, and all the migration scholars say, but this is not a migration scholar. Why is he's talking about that? There is this protective, and but the truth is that when we talk with a lot of people, they define themselves as humanitarian. If you talk with the Free Burma Rangers, as I mentioned before, These people in Myanmar doing evangelical work, they define themselves as humanitarians. So we have to take that seriously. So otherwise we would only be, forced within this understanding of what a humanitarian is by, the MSF definitions, ICSC, and so on. But the truth is that there is an explosion of this kind of notion, and people define themselves as humanitarians. So that should be taken seriously. And about the improvisation, I think that is a very good point, because there is a basic misunderstanding, and that is produced by the industry itself of humanitarian field as a highly professionalized field. So things work well, things are very efficient, but the large amount of work that is done is very contingent, is very everyday improvised. Also, the work done by big organizations. Not only small volunteers. I used the example of small volunteers just to create an exemplary vignette. But this is the reality of all kinds of humanitarians on the field. Very contingent, situational, changing day by day based on what's happening, and the number of the amount of everyday failures and things that don't work is enormous also. Things that should have been done in that way, they don't work. So that's the reality. So of course it is something that needs to be considered, because one question that we have to ask is why there is always this gap between the description of what it should be and what it is in reality, right? If you look at the website of the ICRC, they say neutrality is our value and so on. When I was talking to the special advisor of the president of the ICRC, he said, I can't care less about neutrality. For me, the important thing is access. So why this gap between public image and what's happening in reality? And that, of course, one easy answer is that it is easier to sell the image of the hero doctor who saved a life than that of someone who goes to negotiate with the Taliban. It's difficult to say, give me €5 and I will negotiate with the Taliban. That's not a good advertisement. So this gap has to be, in a way, always being addressed.
I don't think I have anything else to say. I would say that I think we do see a lot of, there's definite conflict within the humanitarian milieu, whatever that is, and wherever we set the boundaries around who gets to call themselves humanitarians, right? And I think there are some sort of traditional Dunontis type humanitarian organizations which really cling to setting the boundaries and protecting the humanitarian space from other people claiming to be doing humanitarianism, right? So I think there is a really interesting tension also, within what we're calling humanitarianism, which speaks to these multiple humanitarianisms, and also speaks to this sort of the understanding of, are we going to see multiple humanitarianisms in the future, be they everyday grassroots or be they multipolar humanitarianisms? And that certainly did come out in the scenario plannings that we were doing, was that one of the big fears of this end to the liberal order was going to be that it's going to be China, it's going to be Dubai. Rafif Ziada's written some really good stuff on Dubai as a sort of the logistics hub of global humanitarianism. But it's going to be these places that are going to be leading the charge. And so for some of these organizations that may or may not be like the ICRC and their fellow travelers, this is very scary to these people because they are very much rooted in a particular Western, Swiss kind of understanding of what humanitarianism is, right? I was going to say everything you said about improvisation. There's an obsession with toolkits, there's an obsession with logistics and standardization, and everybody clings to it when there's uncertainty, but actually it's continuously improvised. The history of humanitarianism is improvisation, whether it's because people get annoyed and leave one organization and set up another organization, that's also improvisation. But it's funny that people cling to the things that they know in moments of uncertainty and therefore project those things into the future.
Thank you so much for these really rich reflections and papers presented. We were very happy we could keep you a bit longer. in Copenhagen. So thank you so much for coming. Also thank you, and sorry for keeping you a little bit longer. It has really been a pleasure, and also thank you for engaging so lively in the debate. Hope to see you soon.